Number 1. Marvin Gaye. He was the Prince of Soul, the man with the velvet voice who taught the world how to love, how to heal, and how to protest. Marvin Gaye was not just a singer, he was a musical prophet. With hits like What's Going On and Sexual Healing, he defined the sound of a generation, blending the sensual with the spiritual in a way that no one has ever replicated. He was adored by millions, wealthy and revered as a genius. But while he was singing about peace and love to the world, he was living in a war zone at home. The greatest tragedy of Marvin Gaye's life was not that he died young, but that the man who took his life was the very man who gave it to him. This is the heartbreaking story of a father's envy and a son's despair. We are investigating the 10 most tragic cases of music legends who were betrayed and murdered by the people they trusted most, their own families. If you believe that the stories of these icons deserve to be told with respect and truth, subscribe to this channel right now. And if you appreciate deep dive storytelling that honors the legends we lost, hit the like button to support this investigation. The story begins in Washington, D.C., in a house ruled by fear. Marvin Gaye Sr. was a preacher, a man of God who demanded absolute perfection and enforced it with brutal violence. He was a strict disciplinarian who beat his children for the smallest infractions, yet he himself lived a bizarre double life, known for cross-dressing and heavy drinking. From the very beginning, he resented his son. As young Marvin's talent began to shine, his father's jealousy grew. He famously told his son that he would never amount to anything, that his voice was worthless. But Marvin proved him wrong. He became a global superstar. He added the E to his last name to distance himself from his father, but he could never truly escape the man's shadow. By 1983, Marvin Gaye was spiraling. Despite his massive success with Sexual Healing, he was struggling with severe depression, paranoia, and cocaine addiction. He moved back into his parents' large house in Los Angeles, ostensibly to take care of his mother, Alberta, who was recovering from surgery. But the house became a pressure cooker. Marvin Gaye Sr., now old and frail but still filled with venomous rage, hated having his famous son in the house. They fought constantly. The father would scream at the son, and the son, fueled by drugs and a lifetime of trauma, would scream back. It was a toxic, deadly cycle that everyone in the family saw, but no one could stop. The irony of the tragedy is sickening. Just months before his death, Marvin Gaye had given his father a Christmas present. It was a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson pistol. Marvin gave it to him for protection against intruders. He had unknowingly armed his own executioner. On April 1, 1984, the day before Marvin's 45th birthday, the tension finally snapped. It started as a small, petty argument about a missing insurance policy letter. Marvin's father was screaming at his mother, Alberta, rushing around the house in a rage. Marvin, lying in his bed, shouted for his father to leave her alone. When the shouting didn't stop, Marvin got out of bed. He walked into his parents' room and confronted his father. According to his mother, Marvin shoved his father and kicked him, a final desperate act of defiance against the man who had abused him for 40 years. His mother separated them, and Marvin returned to his bedroom, sitting on his bed, trying to cool down. He thought the fight was over, but Marvin Gaye Sr. was not done. He walked down the hall, entered Marvin's bedroom, and without saying a word, raised the .38 special that his son had bought him. He aimed at the chest of the Prince of Soul. He fired. The bullet pierced his heart. It was a fatal wound. But the father wasn't finished. He walked closer to his dying son and fired a second shot, point blank, into his shoulder. It was an execution. Marvin Gaye, the man who sang "Mercy, Mercy Me," received no mercy from his own flesh and blood. His mother screamed, running from the room in terror. When the police arrived, they found the music legend dead on the floor of his bedroom. His father was sitting calmly on the front porch, the gun lying on the lawn. When asked if he loved his son, Marvin Gaye Sr. coldly replied, "Let's say I didn't dislike him." The trial was a travesty of justice. Marvin Gaye Sr. had a brain tumor, and his lawyers argued that he was not fully in control of his actions. He pleaded non-contest to voluntary manslaughter. The man who murdered one of the greatest artists in history was sentenced to a 6-year suspended sentence and 5 years of probation. He never spent a single day in prison for the murder. He died in a nursing home in 1998. Marvin Gaye's last words, whispered to his brother as he lay dying, were haunting. "I got what I wanted. I couldn't do it myself." It suggests that perhaps in some dark way he knew that his story could only end at the hands of the man who started it. This case leaves us with a chilling question about the nature of family and jealousy. Do you believe Marvin's father was truly driven by mental illness? Or was this the final act of a jealous man who simply hated his son's success? Let me know your verdict in the comments.
Number 2. Lee Morgan. In the smoky, dimly lit jazz clubs of New York City during the 1960s, there was no star brighter or cooler than Lee Morgan. He was a trumpet prodigy, a musical genius who played with a fire and technical proficiency that left audiences spellbound. He was the definition of cool, a man who had played on John Coltrane's Blue Train and had his own massive hit with the Sidewinder, a track that crossed over from the jazz charts to the pop charts and defined the hard bop era. But the jazz world is often a place where brilliance dances with darkness, and Lee Morgan's life was a pendulum swinging between the two. His story is not just a tale of murder, it is a tragedy of ingratitude and a chilling reminder that the person who saves you can also be the person who destroys you. To understand Lee Morgan's death, you have to understand his life, specifically the darkest chapter of it. By the late 1960s, the trumpet prodigy had fallen from grace. He was a heroin addict, unreliable, homeless, and hawking his trumpet just to get a fix. He was sleeping on the streets, a ghost of his former self, left for dead by an industry that had moved on. It was in this gutter that he met Helen Moore. Helen wasn't a musician. She was a tough, street-smart woman who lived in Hell's Kitchen. She saw the broken man shivering in the cold, and she took him in. She didn't just give him a bed, she gave him a life. Helen nursed him through the agonizing withdrawals of heroin addiction. She fed him, she clothed him, and she ultimately helped him get his trumpet back. She became his manager, his booker, his wife in everything but a legal certificate. She was his savior. Because of Helen, Lee Morgan made one of the greatest comebacks in jazz history. He got clean, he started touring again, and he reclaimed his throne as a jazz giant. She was the rock upon which he rebuilt his church of sound. But as Lee's fame returned, so did his ego. He began to resent the woman who had seen him at his lowest. He started seeing a younger woman, a girl named Judith Johnson. He began to push Helen away, treating the woman who saved his life with open disrespect. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind, a rejection of the very person who had breathed life back into his lungs. This creates a complex moral dilemma about debt and relationships. Do you think a partner who saves an addict is entitled to their loyalty forever? Or does the recovered person have the right to move on, even if it seems ungrateful? Let me know your perspective on this dynamic in the comments. On the night of February 19, 1972, a massive blizzard was hammering New York City. The snow was piling up, burying the streets, but inside a club called Slug's Saloon in the East Village, the air was hot. Lee Morgan was performing. Helen Moore had come to the club that night, perhaps to talk, perhaps to watch him play, but Lee was done with her. In between sets, a furious argument broke out. Lee, emboldened by his success and his new mistress, physically threw her out of the club. He humiliated her in front of the musicians and the fans. He told her to leave and never come back. It was the final insult. Helen walked out into the freezing blizzard, her coat whipping in the wind, but she didn't go home.
She drove her car just a few blocks, sat there for a moment in the cold, and made a decision that would silence a jazz legend forever. She reached into her purse and pulled out a gun. She walked back into Slug's saloon. The band was getting ready for the next set. Lee Morgan was at the bar preparing to go back on stage. He looked up and saw Helen walking toward him. He didn't see the gun until it was too late. She didn't scream. She didn't make a speech. She raised the pistol and fired a single shot directly into his chest. The sound of the gunshot cut through the noise of the club like a trumpet blast. Lee stumbled and fell. Here is the most tragic twist of the entire night, a detail that haunts jazz fans to this day. The wound might not have been fatal. It was serious, but survivable. But because of the massive blizzard raging outside, the ambulance could not get through the streets of New York. The snow was too deep, the emergency services were paralyzed. For an agonizing hour, Lee Morgan lay on the floor of the jazz club, bleeding to death, while the woman who had spent years saving his life stood over him, watching the life she had restored slowly drain away. Helen immediately began to scream, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry," realizing the enormity of what she had done. She had killed her creation. When the police finally arrived, she handed them the gun and sat quietly waiting to be arrested. Lee Morgan was pronounced dead at the age of 33. The tragedy was absolute. A man saved from the slow death of heroin only to meet a sudden violent death at the hands of his savior. Helen was arrested and charged with murder, but she was eventually deemed mentally incompetent to try for a long time and spent time in a hospital before serving a short prison sentence. She spent the rest of her life in obscurity, haunted by that night in the blizzard. She passed away in 1996, taking her full side of the story to the grave. The delay of the ambulance adds a layer of cruel fate to this story. Do you believe Lee Morgan would have survived if the weather had been clear? Or was this a destiny that was sealed the moment he met Helen? I want to hear your thoughts on this twist of fate in the comments. This case forces us to confront the toxic dynamics of dependency and gratitude. Helen gave him everything, and when he tried to leave, she took it all back. It remains one of the most sorrowful chapters in American music, a night when the snow, the gun, and the broken heart of a woman conspired to end a genius.
Number 3. Felix Papalardi. He was the man who brought the heavy to heavy metal, a producer and musician whose fingerprints are all over the DNA of hard rock and whose influence shaped the sound of the late 1960s in ways that are still felt today. Felix Papalardi was a titan of the industry, the brilliant mind behind the supergroup Cream, earning him the unofficial title of the fourth member, alongside Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and Ginger Baker, because of his immense contribution to their studio sound. He was the bassist and vocalist for the band Mountain, giving the world the thunderous, cowbell-heavy anthem Mississippi Queen, a song that defines the genre of hard rock. He was a classically trained musician who understood the structure of sound better than almost anyone in the business, blending the precision of an orchestra with the raw power of amplification. But his intelligence could not save him from the toxic web he had woven in his personal life, a trap of his own making that was baited with love and sprung with gunpowder. This is a story of artistic collaboration turned into a deadly obsession, a reminder that the most dangerous person in a rock star's life is often the one sleeping beside them, and that a creative partnership can easily morph into a destructive rivalry. The story of Felix Papalardi is inextricably linked to his wife, Gail Collins. They were a power couple in the truest sense of the New York rock scene in the late 1960s and 70s. Gail wasn't just a rock wife or a groupie hanging in the background. She was a formidable artist in her own right, a creative force who demanded to be heard. She wrote the lyrics to many of Cream's hits, including Strange Brew and World of Pain, and she designed the psychedelic album covers for Mountain that became iconic visual representations of the music. They were partners in art, in business, and in life, creating a synergy that seemed unbreakable from the outside.
But inside their high-rise Manhattan apartment on the East Side, the dynamic was far darker, a pressure cooker of ego and chemical dependency. Friends and associates described Gayle as intensely controlling, a woman who wielded her influence over Felix with an iron grip, managing his career and his life with a possessiveness that bordered on mania. It was a relationship fueled by drugs, ego, and a volatile open marriage arrangement that was doomed to fail. This brings up a difficult question about the blurred lines between love and management. Do you think it is possible for a romantic partner to effectively manage a star's career without the power dynamic destroying the relationship? Or is mixing business and marriage always a recipe for disaster? Let me know your thoughts on this industry standard in the comments. By the early 1980s, the failure of their arrangement was imminent. Felix had begun an affair with a younger woman, and unlike the casual flings of the past that Gayle had tolerated or participated in, this was serious. He was planning to leave Gayle. He was planning to break the partnership and strike out on his own, both romantically and creatively. For a woman like Gayle Collins, who had built her entire identity around being the muse, the manager, and the architect of a rock god's life, this was an unacceptable loss of control. The tension in their fifth-floor Manhattan apartment reached a breaking point on the morning of April 17, 1983. Felix had returned home late, and the arguments that had defined their recent years exploded into a final, fatal confrontation. But this time, words were not enough. In a twist of cruel irony that seems to echo through many of these stories, the weapon used to kill the music legend was a gift he had given to his killer. Felix had bought Gayle a small, silver, .38 caliber Derringer pistol, a surprise present he gave her just months earlier. He had given it to her for protection, a way to keep her safe in the gritty, crime-ridden New York City of the 80s. Instead, that morning, Gayle Collins retrieved the gun from the bedroom. She didn't fire a warning shot. She didn't threaten him to stay. She aimed the Derringer at her husband's neck and pulled the trigger. The bullet severed his carotid artery. Felix Papalardi, the man who defined the sound of an era, died in his own bedroom wearing nothing but his underwear. He was 43 years old. The silence that followed was deafening, the heavy rock thunder silenced by a small silver pistol. Gayle's reaction in the immediate aftermath was not one of a grieving widow, but of a calculated survivor trying to rewrite the narrative. She called the police, but her story was already taking shape, a fabrication designed to save her from prison. She claimed it was a tragic accident. She told investigators that Felix was showing her how to use the gun, giving her a lesson when it simply went off. It was a classic defense, one used in countless domestic shootings, relying on the idea that guns are unpredictable and women are unfamiliar with them. However, the physical evidence told a different story. The angle of the shot, the tension in the marriage, and the fact that Felix was planning to leave her all pointed to a crime of passion, a premeditated execution born of jealousy and rage. She was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The music world was stunned. The woman who had written the lyrics to Strange Brew had brewed a lethal potion of her own. The trial was a sensation in New York, a window into the decadent and dangerous lives of the rock elite. Prosecutors painted a picture of a jealous, controlling woman who rather saw her husband dead than with another woman. They argued that she knew exactly what she was doing when she pulled that trigger. But Gayle stuck to her story of the accident. And in a verdict that shocked the music industry and enraged Felix's friends and fans, the jury believed her. Or at least, they had enough doubt to acquit her of murder. Instead, they found her guilty of the much lesser charge of criminally negligent homicide. It was a slap in the wrist for taking the life of a legend.
This verdict remains one of the most controversial in rock history. Do you believe the accident defense was a brilliant legal maneuver, or was this a clear case of a jury being manipulated? Was justice served, or did a killer walk away with a discount sentence? I want to hear your verdict on this miscarriage of justice in the comments below. The aftermath was perhaps the strangest part of the saga. Gail Collins was sentenced to 4 years in prison, but was released on parole after serving barely 2 years. She vanished from the public eye, a ghost drifting through the world. She moved to Mexico, where she lived a bizarre, reclusive life under a cloud of suspicion and rumors of experimental medical treatments. She was eventually found dead in a Mexican village in 2013, decades after she killed her husband. She never publicly confessed, never offered a true explanation, and took the truth of that morning to her grave. Felix Papalardi's legacy lives on in the thunderous bass lines of classic rock radio, but his life serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the creative partnership that builds you up is the same one that tears you down, and the gift you give for protection can be the very thing that ends your life. He taught the world to play loud, but he died in the quiet intimacy of his own betrayal.
Number 4. Selena. She was not just a singer, she was a cultural phenomenon, a shining light who was on the absolute precipice of global superstardom. Selena Quintanilla Perez was the Queen of Tejano, a charismatic, beautiful, and incredibly talented young woman who was breaking barriers and bridging cultures with a smile that could light up a stadium. She was the Mexican Madonna, poised to release her first English-language crossover album, Dreaming of You, which was guaranteed to make her one of the most famous women on the planet. But just as her star was ascending to its highest point, it was extinguished by the one person whose job was to protect her interests. A woman who had wormed her way into the singer's inner circle until she was treated not as an employee, but as family. This is the story of the ultimate betrayal. A murder born of greed, obsession, and a desperate need to control a star who was rapidly outgrowing her cage. To understand the murder, you have to understand the depth of the deception practiced by Yolanda Saldivar. Yolanda started as a fan, a registered nurse who rapidly pestered Selena's father, Abraham, to start a fan club. Once she got her foot in the door, she never left. She became the president of the fan club, but she wanted more. She ingratiated herself with the entire Quintanilla family, becoming a confidant, a gatekeeper, and eventually the manager of Selena's fashion boutiques. She was so close to the singer that Selena famously called her Mom. She had keys to the business, access to the bank accounts, and the complete trust of a young star who believed that everyone around her had her best interests at heart. But behind the facade of the devoted mother figure was a thief and a pathological liar. By early 1995, the cracks were starting to show. Fans were complaining that they had paid for merchandise they never received. Money was missing from the boutiques. Abraham Quintanilla, a shrewd businessman who had always been wary of outsiders, began to investigate. What he found was evidence of systematic embezzlement. Yolanda was stealing thousands of dollars from the family that had taken her in. On March 9, 1995, the family confronted her. Abraham fired her on the spot, threatening to go to the police if she didn't return the financial records she had stolen. A normal employee would have left in shame, but Yolanda Saldivar was not normal. She was obsessed. Her entire identity was wrapped up in being Selena's favorite. Without Selena, she was nobody. She began to play games, holding the financial documents hostage, claiming she had been raped in Mexico to get sympathy, doing anything to keep Selena in her orbit. On the morning of March 31, 1995, Selena agreed to meet Yolanda alone at the Days Inn Motel in Corpus Christi to retrieve the missing tax records. It was a fatal mistake, born of Selena's kind heart.
She believed she could handle Yolanda, that she could smooth things over and get the paperwork she needed for her taxes. In room 158, the confrontation turned deadly. Selena demanded the documents. Yolanda stalled. She spun more lies. When Selena finally realized that the relationship was over and turned to walk out the door, the woman she called Mom pulled out a .38 caliber Taurus revolver. She didn't hesitate. She fired a single, expanding hollow-point bullet into Selena's back. The bullet severed an artery near her heart. It was a devastating, unsurvivable wound. But Selena, fueled by adrenaline and the sheer will to live, didn't die immediately. She ran. She ran from the room, clutching her chest, leaving a trail of blood that stretched for 390 feet all the way to the motel lobby. Yolanda didn't try to help her. She didn't call 911. She chased her, screaming "bitch" at the dying star. Selena collapsed in the lobby, and with her final breath, she did the one thing that ensured justice would be done. She named her killer. She told the hotel staff, "Yolanda, 158. While doctors tried in vain to save the 23-year-old icon, a bizarre and terrifying standoff was unfolding in the motel parking lot. Yolanda locked herself in her red pickup truck with the gun pointed at her own head. For nearly 10 hours, she held the police at bay, negotiating, crying, and claiming it was an accident, that the gun just went off. It was the final act of a narcissist who wanted to make the tragedy about herself. But the world wasn't looking at her. They were mourning the loss of a generational talent. When the news broke that Selena had passed away, the grief was overwhelming. It wasn't just a celebrity death. It felt like the death of a family member for millions of Latinos across the world. The trial in October 1995 was swift. The defense tried to argue that the shooting was accidental, but the physical evidence and Selena's own dying declaration destroyed that theory. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding Yolanda guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. That date is fast approaching. In March 2025, the woman who killed Selena will be eligible for a parole hearing. This fact has reignited the anger and pain of millions. This brings us to the most difficult question of this entire series. Do you believe that a person who steals a life as bright and promising as Selena's can ever truly pay their debt to society? Should she be released? Or does the magnitude of her betrayal warrant a life behind bars until the very end? Tell me your verdict in the comments below. Yolanda remains in a Texas prison, largely in solitary confinement for her own protection, because the hatred against her has never subsided. Selena's legacy, however, has only grown. Her music is still played at weddings and parties, her fashion is still iconic, and her story is told to new generations. But it remains a story with a hole in the center, the void left by what she could have become if she hadn't been betrayed by the woman she trusted like family.
Number 5. Judith Barsi. This story is perhaps the most shattering on our list because it involves the silencing of a voice that defined the innocence of an entire generation. While she was primarily known as a child actress, Judith Barsi's contribution to the world of sound and musical animation makes her a legend in the truest sense. If you grew up in the 1980s, you know her voice. She was the sweet, optimistic soul behind Ducky in The Land Before Time, famously delivering the line, "Yep, yep, yep," with a musicality that captured hearts worldwide. She was the singing voice of Anne Marie in All Dogs Go to Heaven. She was the tiny, angelic prodigy who was earning $100,000 a year before she even hit puberty, lifting her family out of poverty and into a comfortable life in Los Angeles. But behind the microphone and the bright lights of the studio, Judith was living in a domestic hell that was darker than any horror movie. This is the story of a father whose jealousy and paranoia turned him into the executioner of his own miracle. The villain of this story is Judith Barsi, Judith's father.
He was a plumber by trade, a Hungarian immigrant who had fled the Soviet occupation in the 1950s, but he carried a darkness inside him that no border crossing could leave behind. He was an alcoholic, a paranoid tyrant who ruled his household with absolute terror. As Judith's fame grew, so did Józef's insanity. He wasn't a proud father, he was a threatened one. He saw his daughter's success not as a blessing, but as a threat to his control. He became convinced that his wife, Maria, and Judith were going to leave him, that they were going to take the money and the fame and abandon him. To prevent this, he instituted a reign of psychological and physical torture. He would pull Judith out of bed in the middle of the night and force her to memorize his rules. He famously took a kitchen knife, held it to the 10-year-old girl's throat, and told her, "If you decide not to come back, I will cut your throat." This wasn't a one-time threat. It was the atmosphere she breathed every single day. The stress was so immense that the child star began to pull out her own eyelashes and even the whiskers of her pet cats, a physical manifestation of the unbearable anxiety she was living under. The tragedy of Judith Barsi is not just that her father was a monster, but that the system designed to protect her failed so spectacularly. Maria, her mother, tried to save her. She went to Child Protective Services. She showed them the signs. She told them about the threats. But the investigation was botched. Józef was charming when he needed to be, and the case was closed with the recommendation that Maria simply leave him. But leaving a violent, paranoid abuser is never simple. Maria was terrified that if she tried to run, Józef would hunt them down and kill them, a threat he had made countless times. She began to secretly rent an apartment, slowly moving their belongings out, planning an escape that she hoped would save her daughter's life. But she moved too slowly. Józef sensed he was losing his grip. On the morning of July 25, 1988, the tension in the Barsi house in West Hills finally snapped. Judith had been scheduled for an audition for a new Hanna-Barbera show, another step in her rising career. She never made it. That night, while Judith was sleeping in her bed, the same bed where she surely dreamed of the characters she brought to life, Józef Barsi walked into her room. He put a .32 caliber pistol to her head and fired. He murdered his 10-year-old daughter in her sleep. The sound of the gunshot must have alerted Maria, who ran down the hall. Józef met her and shot her as well. For 2 days, the man lived in the house with the bodies of his wife and daughter. He poured gasoline over them and set the house on fire before going into the garage and turning the gun on himself. The police found the charred remains of the family, a gruesome end to a life that had brought so much joy to the world. The entertainment industry was devastated. The director of The Land Before Time famously said that Judith was Ducky, that her personality was the heart of the film. When the song Love Survives was recorded for All Dogs Go to Heaven, it was dedicated to her memory, a haunting musical tribute to the little girl who never got to hear the final product of her genius. This case forces us to look at the utter failure of the safety nets that are supposed to protect child stars. It raises a furious question about accountability. Do you blame the mother for not leaving sooner, or do you blame the Child Protective Services system that investigated, saw the abuse, and walked away? I want to know who you hold responsible for this failure in the comments below. Judith Barsi is buried in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Los Angeles. Her tombstone reads, "Yep, yep, yep," a permanent echo of the character she immortalized. She remains a symbol of lost potential, a reminder that the voices that sing the sweetest songs are sometimes crying for help in a language that the adults around them refuse to understand. Her father didn't just kill a child, he killed a future, silencing a talent that was only just beginning to find its range.
Number 6. Al Jackson Jr. They called him the human timekeeper. If you have ever tapped your foot to a soul record from the 1960s or 70s, you were likely moving to the beat of Al Jackson Jr. He was the drummer for Booker T and the MGs, the house band for Stax Records, and the rhythmic backbone of Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, and Al Green. He didn't just play the drums, he defined the Memphis sound, a groove so deep and precise that it changed the course of American music. He was a legend, a wealthy, respected musician who had climbed to the very top of the industry. But while he was keeping perfect time on stage, his time on Earth was running out, ticking down to a violent explosion within the walls of his own home. This is the story of a toxic marriage that spiraled into madness, a love story that turned into a murder mystery which remains one of the darkest chapters in music history. The tragedy of Al Jackson Jr. centers on his relationship with his wife, Barbara Jackson. To the outside world, they were a successful, glamorous couple living the high life in Memphis. But behind closed doors, their marriage was a volatile war zone fueled by jealousy and control. By 1975, the timekeeper was looking to make a change. He was planning to file for divorce, intending to leave the toxicity behind and start a new chapter. But in the world of high-stakes domestic conflict, trying to leave is often the most dangerous move a person can make. The warning signs were not subtle. They were flashing neon red. In July 1975, just months before his death, a violent domestic dispute erupted in their home. In the heat of the argument, Barbara Jackson pulled out a gun and shot her husband in the chest. It was a life-threatening injury. Al survived, but in a move that baffles modern observers, he chose not to press charges. Perhaps he wanted to avoid the scandal. Perhaps he thought he could manage the situation, or perhaps he simply underestimated the danger he was in. He told friends he was going to leave her, but he stayed in the house, a decision that would ultimately seal his fate. On the night of October 1, 1975, Al Jackson Jr. returned to his Memphis home after attending a screening of the Ali Frazier Thrilla in Manila fight. He walked through the door expecting to find his wife. He did, but she wasn't alone. According to Barbara's account, she ran to him, screaming that there were intruders in the house. Moments later, Al was confronted by men with guns. But this was not a standard robbery. The behavior of the intruders was cold, calculated, and personal. They reportedly beat Al, taunting him. They told him to get down on the floor, and then they executed him. They shot the legendary drummer 5 times in the back. It was a cowardly, brutal end for a man who had brought so much joy to the world. The intruders then fled, leaving Barbara physically unharmed, but tied up, a detail that police would later scrutinize intensely. When the Memphis police arrived, the scene didn't sit right. It looked like a robbery, but nothing of significant value seemed to be the primary target compared to the sheer violence directed at Al. It looked like a hit. The investigation quickly turned its gaze toward the grieving widow, the same woman who had put a bullet in Al's chest just 3 months earlier. The suspicion was thick in the Memphis air. Was this a burglary gone wrong? Or was it a contract killing orchestrated by a spouse who refused to be divorced? The police suspected that Barbara had hired the men to finish the job she had started in July. The theory was that she knew he was about to leave her and take his fortune with him, and she decided that if she couldn't have him, no one would. It's a narrative as old as time, but in the context of a music legend, it felt like a Shakespearean tragedy. The aftermath was a legal and emotional quagmire. The suspected triggerman was a man named Mayo Hampton, who was reportedly an acquaintance of Barbara. However, the justice system failed Al Jackson Jr. completely. There was insufficient evidence to conclusively link Barbara to a murder-for-hire plot in a court of law at first, and the case against the intruders was fraught with complications. The murder of the human timekeeper officially remains one of the most frustrating legal cases in history because although convictions were initially secured, legal technicalities later overturned them. Barbara Jackson lived the rest of her life under the shadow of that night, dying in 1982, taking her secrets with her. Al's music lives on. Every time you hear Green Onions or Let's Stay Together, you are hearing his ghost. But his life serves as a grim warning about the dangers of ignoring the violence in your own home. This case leaves us with a haunting ambiguity.
Do you believe it was a random home invasion, or do the previous shooting and the timing of the divorce point to a cold-blooded setup by his wife? I want to know your theory on this unsolved mystery in the comments below. The courts released them on a technicality, but the evidence of the conspiracy was overwhelming. It remains a story of a beat that was stopped too soon, silenced by the very person who had vowed to stand by his side.
Number 7. Peter Tosh. He was the stepping razor, the militant heart of reggae music, and the only man on earth who could stand toe-to-toe with Bob Marley and not blink. Peter Tosh was a founding member of the Wailers, a lyrical revolutionary who preached equal rights and justice and championed the legalization of marijuana long before it was culturally acceptable to do so. He was a towering figure, a martial arts expert who carried himself with the swagger of a man who feared no government, no system, and no police force. But while he spent his life fighting against Babylon and systemic oppression, the threat that would eventually silence his voice did not come from the authorities or the politicians he railed against. It came from a man he had welcomed into his own home, a man he had fed, clothed, and treated like a blood brother. This is the devastating story of a Good Samaritan act that turned into a massacre. A chilling reminder that sometimes the hand you hold out to help someone is the same hand that will eventually pull the trigger. To understand the murder of Peter Tosh, you have to understand his philosophy of brotherhood. He believed in the unity of the oppressed, particularly the downtrodden and the poor of Jamaica. He lived in a fortress-like home in Barbican, Kingston, but his heart was open to the streets. Enter Dennis Lepo Lobban. Lobban was not a musician. He was a ghetto hustler, a man down on his luck who had served time in prison and had nowhere else to go. When Lepo was released, Peter Tosh, seeing a man in need, took him under his wing. Tosh gave him money to get back on his feet, he gave him food, and he allowed him access to his inner circle, treating him with the respect due a family member. Friends warned Tosh about Lepo, sensing a darkness and a greed in the man. But Tosh waved them off, believing that his kindness would be repaid with loyalty. It was a fatal miscalculation of human nature. Lobban didn't see a mentor. He saw a bank account. He saw a man living in luxury while he struggled, and that gratitude slowly curdled into a toxic, murderous entitlement. On the night of September 11, 1987, Peter Tosh was relaxing at his home in Kingston with his common-law wife, Marlene Brown, and several friends, including the DJ Jeff Fry Dixon. It was supposed to be a quiet evening of celebration, as Tosh had just returned from a successful business trip to the United States, eager to settle back into the rhythm of island life. But the peace was shattered when 3 armed men forced their way through the gate. Leading the pack was Dennis Lepo Lobban. He wasn't there to say thank you. He was there to collect. The men stormed the living room, brandishing guns, and immediately demanded that Tosh hand over U.S. currency. They believed that because he had just returned from America, he must be hoarding cash in the house. Tosh told them calmly but firmly that he didn't have any money in the house, that his business dealings were handled by accountants and banks. But Lepo, blinded by greed and perhaps humiliated by his own dependence on Tosh, didn't believe him. The invasion turned into a torture session. For hours, the gunmen held the group hostage. They pistol-whipped Peter Tosh, beating the legend mercilessly in his own living room, demanding the dollars. Tosh, tough as nails to the end, refused to break. He kept repeating that there was no money. The situation escalated from robbery to sadism. Lepo, realizing he wasn't going to get the payday he envisioned, decided to exact a different kind of payment. He put the gun to the head of the man who had tried to save his life. He didn't just shoot Peter Tosh, he executed him. He shot him twice in the head. The gunman then opened fire on the rest of the room in a chaotic spray of bullets, aiming to leave no witnesses. DJ Fry Dixon was killed,
Marlene Brown was shot in the head but miraculously survived by playing dead. Several others were wounded. It was a bloodbath, a senseless slaughter of one of the most important voices in music history, all for money that wasn't even there. When the gunmen fled, they left behind a scene of carnage that shocked the world. The stepping razor was dead at 42. The investigation was chaotic given the violence of 1980s Kingston, but Marlene Brown's testimony was the key. She identified Leppo. She knew him. She had fed him. She knew exactly who had pulled the trigger. Dennis Laban was arrested and charged with the murders. The trial was a sensation in Jamaica. Leppo claimed he was innocent, that he was being framed, but the eyewitness accounts were damning. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted to life in prison due to legal technicalities regarding capital punishment in Jamaica. He remains in a Jamaican prison to this day, maintaining his innocence, a ghost of the past. The murder of Peter Tosh remains a heavy scar on the soul of reggae music. It wasn't a political assassination like the attempt on Bob Marley, it was personal. It was a betrayal of friendship. This case forces us to confront the dangerous reality of envy. Do you believe that Peter Tosh's generosity was his downfall, or was Leppo a psychopath who would have eventually turned on anyone regardless? Is there a limit to how much we should trust those we try to help? I want to hear your thoughts on this complex moral tragedy in the comments below. Peter Tosh died because he opened his door to a man who had nothing, only to find that the man wanted everything, including his life. He remains the ultimate example of a legend who was killed not by the system he fought, but by the brother he tried to save.
Number 8. Brian Jones. We have explored the horrors of parents killing children and wives killing husbands, but now we turn our gaze to the murky waters of rock and roll royalty, where the definition of family often extends to the entourage, the handlers, and the people paid to live inside the mansion. This is the story of the original golden boy of the British invasion, a man whose death was officially ruled an accident for decades, but whose final moments tell a much darker story of domestic betrayal and a fight over money that turned fatal. He was the founder of the Rolling Stones, the multi-instrumentalist genius who gave the band its name, its sound, and its dangerous edge. His name was Brian Jones. He was the blonde-haired, fashion-obsessed icon who defined the swinging 60s London scene. But by 1969, he was a fallen angel, kicked out of the very band he created, isolated in a country estate, and living with a man who was supposed to be fixing his house, but ended up destroying his life. This is the story of a murder that was allegedly covered up by the very machinery of fame that created him. To understand the tragedy of Brian Jones, you have to understand his final days at Cochford Farm. This was the former home of A. Milne, the creator of Winnie the Pooh, a fairy tale setting for a rock star's retirement. But the atmosphere inside was anything but whimsical. Brian, struggling with drug addiction and the heartbreak of being fired from the Rolling Stones, had surrounded himself with a chaotic mix of girlfriends and employees. The most prominent among them was Frank Thorogood. Thorogood was a builder hired to renovate the estate, but he had become something more, a live-in companion, a minder, and a man who felt increasingly entitled to Brian's lifestyle. The dynamic was toxic. Brian was the wealthy, erratic rock star. Thorogood was the rough, working-class builder who felt underpaid and disrespected. The tension in the house was palpable, fueled by alcohol and arguments over money. Brian famously treated Thorogood poorly, and Thorogood, a man with a violent temper, was simmering with resentment. He wasn't just an employee, he was a member of the household, a part of the domestic family that Brian relied on, and that reliance would prove to be a fatal mistake. On the night of July 2, 1969, the heat wave in England was oppressive. Brian Jones decided to take a midnight swim in his heated pool. He was joined by Thorogood and a few others. The party had been drinking, but witnesses later stated that Brian was coherent, happy, and looking forward to his future post-Rolling Stones.
What happened next is a blur of conflicting testimonies and police incompetence, but the core of the murder theory centers on a violent argument between Brian and Thorogood. He was demanding money he felt he was owed for the renovations. Brian refused. The other guests went inside, leaving the rock star and the builder alone in the pool. Minutes later, Thorogood entered the house, shaking and wet, claiming that something happened to Brian. When they ran back out, the founder of the Rolling Stones was motionless at the bottom of the pool. He was pulled out, but it was too late. The coroner ruled it death by misadventure, citing drugs and alcohol, a convenient verdict that closed the book on a troublesome celebrity. But the story didn't die. For decades, whispers circulated in the rock world that this was no accident. The accident theory ignored the fact that Brian was a strong swimmer. It ignored the tension in the house, and it ignored the behavior of Frank Thorogood. The truth finally began to surface years later on Thorogood's own deathbed. According to Tom Keylock, the Stones' road manager who was also present at the house that night, Thorogood confessed in his final moments in 1993. He reportedly said, "It was me that did Brian. I just finally snapped." The confession painted a picture of a fight in the pool, a moment where the builder, fueled by rage and envy, held the rock star's head underwater until he stopped struggling. It wasn't a misadventure. It was a drowning. It was a murder, committed by a man who was living under Brian's roof, eating his food, and taking his money. The police files were reviewed in 2009, but no charges were ever brought as the suspect was dead. This brings us to a chilling question about the price of fame and the cover-ups that protect it. Do you believe the police ignored the signs of foul play to avoid a scandal? Or was Thorogood's confession just the ramblings of a dying man? Was Brian Jones the victim of a domestic murder that history tried to erase? I want to hear your theory on the death of the original Rolling Stone in the comments below. This case remains one of the biggest open secrets in rock history. It fundamentally changes how we view the 27 Club. Brian Jones didn't just burn out. He was extinguished by a member of his own household who decided that a debt over renovations was worth the life of a genius. He remains the ultimate example of the danger of letting the wrong people inside your sanctuary.
Number 9. Slim Duncan. We have explored the betrayal of blood relatives and spouses, but in the world of music, particularly in the tight-knit, high-stakes world of hip-hop, the word family often extends to the crew, the entourage, the brothers forged not by birth, but by the struggle to make it out of the streets. This is the story of a rising star who was the heartbeat of one of the most influential rap collectives of the 2010s. A man who was on the cusp of global fame, only to be silenced by a member of his own musical brotherhood over a dispute so petty, so trivial that it exposes the terrifying fragility of life in the fast lane. His name was Mario Hamilton, but the streets and the charts knew him as Slim Duncan. He was the charismatic 6'8" giant who stood at the right hand of Waka Flocka Flame and Gucci Mane, a central pillar of the Brick Squad monopoly empire. He was a legend in the streets of Atlanta, a mentor to younger artists, and a man whose energy was infectious. But on a cold December night, the recording studio, a place that is supposed to be a sanctuary for art and expression, became a slaughterhouse, proving that envy and ego can turn a friend into an executioner in the blink of an eye. The tragedy of Slim Duncan is a stark reminder of how quickly a family atmosphere can turn toxic. Brick Squad wasn't just a label, it was a fraternity. They lived together, toured together, and recorded together. Slim Duncan was the glue that held much of it together, a rapper with a gritty, authentic voice and a commanding presence. On December 16, 2011, Slim was at a recording studio in Atlanta preparing to shoot a music video for his friend, Gucci Mane. The atmosphere was supposed to be celebratory, a gathering of the family to create art. Among the crowd was Vincent Hardiman, known as Young Vito. Vito was not a stranger. He was an affiliate, a rapper who ran in the same circles, recorded in the same booths, and shook the same hands. He was supposed to be a brother. But beneath the surface of camaraderie, there was a simmering tension, a clash of egos waiting for a spark.
That spark didn't come from a contract dispute or a woman. It came from a piece of candy. In the cramped waiting room of the studio, a disagreement broke out between Slim Duncan and young Vito. Witnesses initially reported it started over a game of dice, a common pastime in the studio, but the argument escalated over a piece of candy, specifically a Jolly Rancher. It sounds absurd, almost impossible that a life could end over something so small, but in an environment fueled by testosterone, pride, and the constant pressure to never back down, a small slight can become a lethal insult. Slim reportedly grabbed a piece of candy from Vito's stash. Vito took offense. Words were exchanged. The brotherhood evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold, hard code of the streets. The argument turned physical. Slim, being the massive man he was, reportedly got the better of the physical altercation. In a normal world, this would have ended with a bruise and handshake later. But young Vito wasn't operating in a normal world. He felt disrespected. He felt humiliated in front of the family. He left the room, but he didn't leave the building. He went to his car, or perhaps a bag, and retrieved a handgun. When young Vito returned to the studio, he wasn't looking for an apology. He was looking for revenge. He walked up to Slim Duncan, the man he had collaborated with, the man he had called a friend, and he fired. He shot him once in the chest. The bullet pierced his lung and heart. The giant fell. The studio, filled with dozens of people, erupted into chaos. Young Vito, the brother, fled the scene, leaving Slim bleeding out on the floor of the vocal booth. The tragedy was absolute. Slim was rushed to Grady Memorial Hospital, but he was pronounced dead on arrival. He was 24 years old. His career was just beginning. Waka Flocka Flame, his best friend, was devastated, calling Slim his blood brother and spiraling into a deep depression that nearly ended his own career. The betrayal cut deep into the heart of the Atlanta music scene. It wasn't a rival gang or a random robber who killed Slim Duncan. It was someone from inside the circle, someone who sat on the same couch and dreamed the same dreams. The manhunt for young Vito lasted for 10 days. He eventually turned himself in, claiming self-defense, claiming he was afraid for his life because of Slim's size. But the jury saw through the defense. They saw a man who had escalated a fistfight into a murder because his ego had been bruised. However, in a verdict that frustrated the family and the hip-hop community, Vito was acquitted of murder but found guilty of aggravated assault and possession of a firearm. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He served his time and was released, but the shadow of that night remains. Slim Duncan's death marked the end of an era for Brick Squad. A grim reminder that in the music industry, the people you hustle with can be the same people who hurt you. This case leaves us with a terrifying question about the nature of violence and ego. Do you believe that the code of the streets makes tragedies like this inevitable? Or was young Vito a uniquely dangerous individual who would have snapped at anyone? Was this self-defense or a fragile ego with a gun? I want to hear your thoughts on this senseless tragedy in the comments below. Slim Duncan died defending a reputation that didn't need defending, killed by a friend who turned into a foe over nothing more than a sweet treat, leaving a legacy of what-ifs on the Atlanta pavement.
Number 10. William Ouiji Howard. We have traveled through a landscape of horror, witnessing mothers killing sons, wives killing husbands, and fathers killing daughters. We have seen motives ranging from greed to jealousy to insanity. But we end our journey with a case that is perhaps the most terrifying of all. Not because of a grand conspiracy, but because of its sheer, utter pettiness. This is the story of a soul legend, a man whose voice defined the heartbreak and the groove of the 1970s. A man who sang about rain and pain, only to have his life ended in his own living room over a dispute so trivial, so mundane, that it exposes the fragile, violent thread that holds some families together. He was the lead singer of the Dramatics, the voice behind the timeless classic In the Rain.
His name was William Ouiji Howard. He was a titan of R&B, a man who had toured the world, sold millions of records, and earned his place in the pantheon of music history alongside the greats like the Temptations and the OJs. But fame, talent, and legacy offered no protection against the volatile anger of a family member who decided that a moment of annoyance was worth more than a legend's life. This is the final curtain call, the story of a stepfather and a stepson, and a tragedy that proves that the most dangerous weapon in a home isn't always a gun. Sometimes it's a temper. The story takes us to Detroit, Michigan, the heartbeat of soul music. By the year 2000, Ouiji Howard was 49 years old. He was no longer in the bright lights of the 70s, but he was still a working musician, still revered by fans, and living a relatively quiet life. He was living with his wife, Bryson, and her 19-year-old son, Cato Walker. This was not a stranger living in the house. This was his stepson, a young man he had helped raise, a member of the family unit. The dynamic in the house, however, was simmering with an undercurrent of tension that is all too common in blended families. A clash of generations, of authority, and of respect. Ouiji was the man of the house, a man used to commanding stages, expecting a certain level of order. Cato was a teenager, reportedly struggling with the restlessness and rebellion of youth. But no one, absolutely no one, could have predicted that this typical domestic friction would explode into a homicide over something as insignificant as the volume dial on a stereo. On the afternoon of February 22, 2000, the household was calm until it wasn't. Ouiji Howard was at home, trying to relax. In another room, his stepson, Cato, was listening to music. The volume was loud. Too loud. Ouiji, the man with the golden voice, asked for some quiet. He asked Cato to turn it down. It was a request made in millions of homes every single day, a standard parent-child interaction. But on this specific day, in this specific house, the request was met not with compliance, but with a sudden volcanic rage. Cato Walker refused. Words were exchanged. The volume didn't go down. The temperature in the room went up. The argument escalated rapidly, spiraling out of control. It shifted from a dispute about noise to a dispute about respect, about territory, about who was in charge. And then, the unthinkable happened. The 19-year-old stepson didn't just storm out of the room. He didn't just slam a door. He reached for a weapon. In a split second of madness that would destroy 2 lives and shatter a musical legacy, Cato Walker pulled out a gun. He didn't aim at a stranger. He aimed at the man who had put a roof over his head. He fired. He shot William Ouiji Howard in the chest. The soul legend, the man who had sung so beautifully about the pain of heartbreak, fell to the floor of his own home, mortally wounded by his own stepson. The music stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavier than any song Ouiji had ever recorded. He was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was done. The voice of the dramatics was silenced forever. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The motive was nothing more than a stereo. A life of artistry, a career of brilliance, ended because a teenager didn't want to turn down the volume. The aftermath was a blur of shock and grief for the Detroit music community. The Dramatics were icons, and to lose their lead singer in such a senseless, domestic way was incomprehensible. Cato Walker was arrested and charged with murder. The trial didn't have the mystery of a whodunit. The shooter was clear. It was a tragedy of impulse. Cato Walker was found guilty of second-degree murder and possession of a firearm during a felony. He was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison. He threw away his own life, his freedom, and his future, all for a moment of stubborn pride. The case serves as the ultimate grim punctuation mark on our series. It proves that the most dangerous place for a legend isn't always the dark alley or the drug den. Sometimes it's the living room. It proves that the people we let into our hearts and homes have the power to hurt us in ways that no critic or stranger ever could. This concludes our deep dive into the 10 music legends murdered by their own families. This series has shown us that behind the glamour and the gold records, these icons were human beings vulnerable to the same toxic dynamics, jealousies, and sudden violence as anyone else. Do you think fame makes these domestic tragedies more likely due to the pressures of money and ego? Or does it just make them more public? I want to read your final thoughts on this series in the comments below. Ouiji Howard died because of a noise complaint in his own home, leaving behind a legacy of beautiful music and a final tragic lesson about the cost of anger. If this journey into the dark side of music history opened your eyes, please hit the like button, share this video with every music fan you know, and make sure you are subscribed and have the bell turned on. We have a new investigation starting next week that you will not want to miss.